The Fourth Way Up. Chapter 9. Control Centers of the Human Psyche. According to the teaching of the Fourth Way, a person has 7 centers that determine a person's mental activity. These are the lower ones: instinctive, sexual, motor, emotional, and intellectual, as well as the higher emotional and higher intellectual centers. The higher centers of a person who has not worked on himself are dormant, so one cannot observe them. Each lower center has 3 sections: intellectual, emotional, and automatic. Each of these sections can also be divided into 3 parts, but this is not necessary in practice. All lower centers, with the exception of the sexual, also have a negative and a positive side. The concept of mental centers should not be confused with neurophysiological structures. Mental centers are information structures that use neurophysiological and other structures for their specific manifestations. Roles of centers. The role of the instinctive center is to maintain the optimal physiological state of the organism. The sexual center plays the role of a reproducer of this type of organism. The motor center mainly controls the human musculoskeletal system. The emotional center plays the role of a switchboard and translator for the centers. This center is the main one in creating structures of interaction between centers, in other words, in the formation of consciousness. What people understand by emotions in everyday thinking are bodily sensations that are a reaction of the emotional part of the instinctive center to processes occurring in other centers. The intellectual center solves various kinds of abstract logical problems through the intellectual part of the emotional center. The higher emotional center very quickly communicates with the lower centers. It translates the thinking of the higher intellectual center into a language understandable to the lower centers. The higher intellectual center communicates with the outside world at a special information level. Functions of the centers. Specific numbers of hydrogens designate the energy level at which the centers operate. This issue is thoroughly considered in the chapter Man as a Chemical Factory for Food Processing. The abbreviations for the designations of the centers are based on the Latin words intellectus, reason; emotion, emotional excitement; motionis, movement; sexualis, sexual; vitalis, related to life phenomena; hyperemotion, higher emotional; hyperintellectus, higher intellectual. Accordingly, the intellectual center is designated by the letter I, emotional; E, motor; M, sexual; S, instinctive; V, higher emotional; HE, and higher intellectual; HI. The parts of the centers are presented as follows: automatic, 1, emotional, 2, intellectual, 3. The sections of the parts of the centers are designated similarly to the parts: automatic, 1, emotional, 2, intellectual, 3. The functions and abbreviations of the psychic centers and their parts, as well as the energies consumed by them, are given in the following table: intellectual center, intellectual part, I3. Discoveries, strategy, pioneering, inventions, hydrogen-48, intellectual center, emotional part, I2. Love of knowledge, the magnetic center of a yogi, hydrogen-48. Intellectual center, automatic part, I1. Counting, speech formulation, mechanical thinking with cliches and templates, primitive logic. Memory of the intellectual center, hydrogen-48. Emotional center, intellectual part, E3. Conscience, poetry, humor, artistic creativity, subtle emotional assessments, distinguishing lies, the magnetic center of the adept of the Fourth Way, hydrogen-24 and 12. Emotional center, emotional part, E2. Love for people and God, emotional acceptance and rejection, the magnetic center of the monk. Hydrogen 24 and 12. Emotional center, negative emotional part, E2. This part contains negative emotions created by upbringing and artificial formation in the emotional center. Memory of negative emotions. Hydrogen 24 and 12. Emotional center, automatic part, E1. Like-dislike, primitive emotional assessments. Memory of the emotional center. Hydrogen 24 and 12. Motor center, intellectual part, M3. Combinatory inventions, tactical solutions, mechanical thinking, writing, reading, voice, and complex movements. Hydrogen 24, 48. Motor center, emotional part, M2. Pose, facial expressions, gestures, intonations, breathing, imitation, the magnetic center of the fakir, curiosity. Hydrogen 24 and 12. Motor center, automatic part, M1. Walking, chewing, swallowing, breathing, spitting, blinking. Memory of the motor center. Hydrogen 24 and 12. Sexual center. Intellectual part, S3. Sexual behavior and evaluations. Hydrogen 12. Sexual center. Emotional part, S2. Sexual desire and arousal. Hydrogen 12. Sexual center. Automatic part, S1. Ejaculation. Orgasm. Memory of the sexual center. Hydrogen 12. Instinctive center. Intellectual part, V3. The processes of eating and drinking, breathing, excretion of body waste, falling asleep, and waking up. Hydrogen 24 and 12. Instinctive center, emotional part, V2. The desire of drinking, eating, sleeping, warmth, cold, excretion of waste. Hydrogen 24, 12. Instinctive center, automatic part, V1. Circulation, digestion, respiration, thermoregulation, vomiting, sweating, sneezing, yawning, coughing. Memory of the instinctive center. Hydrogen 24 and 12. Let us consider the functions of each of the lower centers. Intellectual center, intellectual part. Discoveries, higher logic, emotional part. Curiosity, thirst for knowledge, intellectual interests. Location of the magnetic center of yogis, automatic part. Counting, speech. Negative side, thoughtless rejection of certain ideas and their refutation. The language of the center is words and verbal constructions. Its memory is expressed in words. Emotional center. The intellectual part is responsible for poetry, artistic creativity, conscience, humor. The magnetic center for a student of the fourth way, and subtle emotional discrimination. For example, recognition of lies. We should discuss this important part of the center in more detail. This is the place of connection of the lower and higher centers. Here, the transformation of C12 into door 6 occurs. This is the most subtle and fragile formation among the lower centers. The emotional part of the emotional center is love for God and people, compassion, but not pity, and the location of the monk's magnetic center. On the negative side, it should be said that there are two of them. One is natural, adequately reacting to real unpleasant life situations, for example, rejection of disharmony in a work of art. The other is artificial, not corresponding to the real situation. For example, a person imagines himself to be sick and experiences fear about this. Another example is being afraid of darkness, thunderstorms, mice, cockroaches, etc. This side takes up much more space in the emotional center than the naturally reacting part. The artificial side of the emotional center is highly parasitic and harmful since it only consumes energy and disrupts the normal functioning of the centers. As we can see, this part of the emotional center is one of the elements in our psyche that causes energy leakage and therefore requires the most serious monitoring. The automatic part of the emotional center gives automatic reactions, such as fear of real danger, for example, a response to a barking dog that suddenly appears. The language of the emotional center is concrete and abstract visual images of varying levels of complexity. The memory of emotionally significant situations is located here, especially events associated with dangers. The blocks of negative emotions are also hidden here. The motor center. The intellectual part of the motor center is responsible for learning complex movements. Another function of this part is inventions, i.e., complex manipulations with already known information. Body postures, gestures, facial expressions, and voice intonations represent this center's emotional part. This part of the center is responsible for imitation. The automatic part of the motor center is responsible for automatic movements, for example, swallowing, sneezing, yawning, blinking, and trembling. Some movements controlled by the automatic part of the motor center could once be learned through its intellectual part. Tracking involuntary movements and tensions of the body is an important moment of self-observation for the subsequent fight against energy leaks. The language of the center is kinesthetic images. The memory of the motor center is located in its automatic part, the instinctive center. The instinctive center also consists of three sections. The intellectual one controls the respiratory and excretory functions, sleep, and wakefulness. The emotional part of this center manifests itself through the desire for food, drink, and excretion of body waste. The automatic part of the center controls the heartbeat, blood circulation, breathing, digestion, sweating, salivation, lacrimation, etc. The language of the center is sensations in the body. The sexual center. The sexual center is represented in the human psyche more thoroughly than the instinctive center. The intellectual part of the center is associated with sexual behavior and evaluations. Gurdjieff emphasized that the evaluations of the sexual center are faster and ahead of other centers. Without realizing it, a person already perceives the world in a distorted way due to the evaluations of the sexual center. The emotional part controls sexual arousal and desire. The mechanical part is responsible for ejaculation or orgasm. The language of the center is sensations in the genital area. There are two types of memory in the centers: short-term, located in the intellectual parts of the centers, and long-term, located in the automatic parts of the centers. From the table, it is clear that some vital functions, such as breathing, are duplicated by many centers to prevent death in the event of a stoppage of one or another mental center. Some functions, such as verbal thinking, exist in the intellectual center and the intellectual part of the motor center. Naturally, in the motor center, thinking is very simplified. It is a prevalent type of thinking. Even more primitive thinking occurs in the automatic part of the intellectual center. Such thinking is built on clichés and opinions. Incomprehensible knowledge is explained by incomprehensible knowledge. Instead of deep thinking, one or another label is stuck. For example, regarding Gurdjieff's teaching, people with such thinking say, "Ah, this is the man who called for shortening the time of night sleep. What a moron." Of course, such thinking is more common in people with the active motor or emotional center, i.e., in people number 1 and 2. But even intellectually active people are not guaranteed to avoid primitivism in their thinking. Studying the above table, one should pay attention to the similarities and differences in the reactions of the emotional parts of the intellectual and motor centers. In the first case, this is the desire for knowledge, curiosity, and in the second case, this is a parody of curiosity, inquisitiveness. Higher centers. People rarely encounter manifestations of the higher psychic centers, and such events become the core of legends about miracles, something mystical, mysterious, incomprehensible, and transcendental. Only by specifically working with these centers does a person understand that they have logic and laws that more accurately reflect reality than those known by the lower centers. Knowledge of these laws and a direct, clear vision of reality make it possible to obtain new knowledge. Here is a dividing line between people who receive knowledge from books, from other individuals, or from their own experience, limited by a low level of consciousness, and people who obtain knowledge with the help of higher centers. With certain simplifications, the functions of the higher centers can be summarized in the following table. The higher emotional center, he, inspection of the structure of the psyche, detection and elimination of malfunctions in it. A special type of connection of centers, intuition, limited telepathy, and clairvoyance, connection with the higher intellectual center, management of the intellectual part of the emotional center, self-awareness, super-learning ability, hydrogen 12 and 6. The higher intellectual center, Chi, complete telepathy and clairvoyance, special communication of centers, highest understanding of reality, objective consciousness, communication with consciousnesses of any level. Hydrogen 6 and 3. The higher emotional center gives vision, but one can correctly interpret it only after completely neutralizing the false personality. In cases of interference of the false personality, a distortion of vision occurs. If, at the moment of opening the higher emotional center, a person is in a state of self-remembering, then this program that unites the centers and opens up consciousness is realized in the higher emotional center. A new type of consciousness will arise, self-remembering. The transformation of sexual energy, C12, into the energy of the astral body. Door 6 will begin. Other programs can give one or another version of trance. If an individual has a somewhat tense emotional state as a result of excess C12, it will turn into euphoria. The emotional part will maintain such a state in the emotional center. The intellectual part of this center will lose its activity. The connection with the higher emotional center will cease. On C12, the emotional part of the emotional center will work very intensively. Instead of a real vision, a vivid imagination will arise, and consequently, mania. Criticism towards oneself and one's ideas will be lost. The depth of identification will be very great. The individual will believe in his most delusional ideas. He will be God, the Messiah, and the Emperor. It will be difficult to convince such a Napoleon of the fallacy of his vision. Of course, he will find an excuse for his lack of real support for his destiny. We had to see a person who became a victim of a sect. As a result of long-term sexual abstinence and constant repetition of a particular mantra, he fell into a trance from which he was brought out only in a psychiatric hospital. We observed similar moments of hallucinations, which were taken for mystical revelations, in one priest who had 30 years of experience in sexual abstinence. He talked with the Mother of God as if he were his girlfriend. This priest became a sectarian. Gurdjieff warned most seriously against experiments with sexual energy and trances. That is why seers and prophets, as history shows, often make mistakes in their forecasts. A man number 5, with incorrect crystallization of the essence, will be such a prophet. On the one hand, the higher emotional center contacts the lower centers through the intellectual part of the emotional center. On the other hand, it interacts with the higher intellectual center. Thus, the higher emotional center translates information from the higher intellectual center to the lower centers. Suppose a person's intellectual part of the emotional center is not developed, and there is no program for contact with the higher emotional center. In that case, the higher centers do not exist for that person. Then such things as telepathy and clairvoyance are nothing more than imagination. The program for contact with the higher emotional center is deep self-remembering. Me, 12. If the intellectual part of the emotional center does not work well, then the vision consists of a number of rapidly changing pictures. In this case, a person does not have time to understand what he sees. If the higher emotional center does not work, the seer does not understand the meaning of the symbols appearing from the higher intellectual center, if he remembers them at all. We should immediately note that including the higher intellectual center without the higher emotional center is an unusual case, often associated with traumatic phenomena. Another function of the higher centers is high-speed communication between the intellectual and emotional centers. If this occurs only due to the higher emotional center, then the information stored in all lower centers becomes fully accessible. In the teaching of the fourth way, this form of consciousness is called self-awareness. As a result, the speed of understanding increases according to the rise in the volume of information transfer. According to experimental data, the speed of understanding in the state of self-awareness is 10,000 times greater than in the state of ordinary waking consciousness. In a person in ordinary consciousness, the speed of communication between the centers is limited by the low speed of transmission and translation of information from one center into the language of another center. There are many reasons for this situation. One of them is the incorrect operation of the centers, in particular, the work of the emotional center on low-quality energy. If both higher centers work simultaneously, then the speed of information exchange between the lower centers is even higher, and in addition, a flow of clairvoyant and telepathic information from the higher intellectual center goes to these centers. This new form of consciousness is called objective consciousness. There is a particular paradox in the words objective consciousness, but only for our ordinary consciousness. The higher emotional and intellectual centers open and work simultaneously and harmoniously only in people who have achieved inner purity and sincerity. These centers give a person full power over his own organism, and those incredible powers called siddhis in yoga. At this point, we can finish talking about the functions of the centers and move on to studying the centers' interactions with each other.